we all like to think that we operate rationally, that we weigh up the fact against the fiction to come to a logical, reasoned conclusion. But that might not be the case, and it might not be the case in particular with our politics. Emotion driving much more powerfully the way that we act and vote politically, but also how we identify and who we identify with seems to be having more of an impact over our politics than the arguments they're making, the rationale that they're setting forth. And joining me today on Politics Unchained to try and unpack this and work out what's really driving our politics is Drew Westen. He spent many, many years studying psychology, voter messaging and testing in the behaviours that drive people's political actions. Drew, you heard from the intro there. I'm fascinated by what actually changes people's minds, because we think we're rational and that the decisions we make are rational. I'm sure we're going to unpack whether that's true or not, but what actually makes a difference to people's political thinking?
Well, you're presuming there is political thinking. Much of the time, actually, the old models have all stressed, both in political science and sort of in lore, in campaign lore, that voters weigh the issues and they decide who's better for them, blah blah blah, and none of that turns out to be true. I'm speaking mostly from data from decades of U.S. research in psychology, neuroscience, and political science, but also from the last 20 years or so I've been doing message testing in the U.S. With voters. And basically what happens, the way the brain really works is it doesn't go to conscious level and continue and consider an issue and say, well, how much does that issue matter to me? Okay, I'll weigh that by 0.3. All right, and now I'll go to this issue. How does that matter? I'll weigh that by 0.2. Oh, I guess I'll vote for the Tories. It doesn't work that way. The way it really works is that there are two things happening simultaneously in the brain, and one of them appears to happen a little bit earlier, and that is emotion kicks in, especially negative emotion, to let you know something's dangerous. If you don't want to go there, if you don't, no, it evolved so that we would, if you saw a predator, or if you saw something coming at your child, when we were in band society, you'd know to get away from it, or if you saw food, you'd know to approach it. But we have a design flaw in our brains, which is that because we're symbolic animals, our brain applies those same rules to ideas that it doesn't like. So what essentially happens is if you try to reason with me about a candidate who I really believe in, and you start throwing out some facts that you have a rational discussion, what really happens is that there is a sort of a pre-evaluation by your emotional systems of do I like or not like what's coming at me? And that spreads either activation or inhibition to the neural networks in the brain that are eventually going to produce your beliefs, consciously and unconscious beliefs. And then simultaneously, but starting a little bit later, it seems, there's not a lot of great data on that, but it appears to be the case, all of the sort of irrational stuff comes in, and it spreads activation to things likely to be true, and it spreads inhibition to things likely to be untrue, and it's making a judgment of goodness of fit to the truth, and the emotions are making a judgment of goodness of fit to what I want to believe and what would be threatening to me. And it turns out that when the two fight with each other, emotion typically wins.
Wow, that is extraordinary, because, just the other day I was having a conversation with somebody who started off by introducing themselves as a former Liberal Democrat councillor, but said that he fell out of love with the party over Europe. He thinks that Nigel Farage is God's gift to politics. Oh, and then he said, and Rupert Lowe, who was kind of expelled from the Reform Party for being kind of too right-wing, he said, now he is the guy that knows how it's done. And, I was just dumbfounded at how you can go from being, pretty much the opposite of reform in every way to thinking that someone who was ejected for being too far right is the answer to life, the universe, and everything. This wasn't a kind of unpleasant or angry man. He just was very straightforward in the way that he set out what he wanted me to hear. The thing that's causing the emotional calculus there, rather than the rational kind of backfilling one, the emotion that wins, how much of that is us based on our experiences? Because you can accept that somebody would reject anything, however plausible, that comes from somebody that they know from past experience is a liar, right? That makes sense. That makes sense why our kind of emotional response would kick in. But is this our emotions, our identities, or is it the sense of identity that we carry around? Is it part of how we associate with a tribe that says that these things are right, these things are wrong?
It's such a great question, and it's, if you were asking me that question back in 2006, and we did the first neuroimaging study on how the brain processes, how it reasons about information that it doesn't want to believe, and it turns out that the reasoning circuits never come on. That's the bad news in politics. But the difference was back then was, we suspected that process of completely, the reasoning circuits don't come on. Our hypothesis was contrary to the 800 or 900 studies that had been done of reasoning. We gave people a reasoning task. We just knew that it was about John Kerry versus George W. Bush in the 2004 election.
I remember.
We gave them each reasoning task that would lead them to believe that Bush or Kerry had done something unscrupulous, or that he was shading the truth, or whatever. They couldn't even go there. And what came on instead were nothing but emotion. First, negative emotion that they weren't aware of. It was unconscious. Then came on emotion regulation circuits at the same time as a part of the brain that monitors conflict and tries to figure out, what do I do with this? And then within 20 seconds they'd rationalized it away, so they had a glib answer for why it wasn't true. The extreme form of this that I'm describing back then was applicable to maybe the 20% on the left and the 20% on the right in the U.S. There's some evidence suggesting that it's gone way up in the last in the last 20 years, and that my guess is it's probably now 40% and 40%, and that there's 20% in the middle who tend to hear with both the left ear and a right ear. And are sort of open to things on both sides, often because they're not highly informed or highly connected to one party or another. But the question you're getting at, in general, it's that we run from things that would make us feel bad. But that gets to that issue about identities, about whether it's our tribe is being threatened, whether it's our identity, some valued identity is being threatened, or whether some valued idea is being threatened.
So I'm interested in the identity thing, but I want to look at it through the lens of persuasion.
Yes,
because most of us in politics have probably realised that the art or the science of persuasion doesn't lie in having the right answer or explaining things. It lies in something else, which I guess I wouldn't have got elected if I wasn't sort of semi-aware of. But what does persuade people? Because politics is the art of persuasion. What does persuade people if we have to rely upon those emotional systems? And as you said, if the reasoning circuitry just doesn't light up, then what circuits are we able to light up with our persuasion? So
on questions where people aren't really set in their beliefs, the reasoning circuits do come on, and they tend to dominate. It's really a range of two things. It's a range of how important the issue is to you and how much it makes you get worked up emotionally, whether you're conscious of it or not. This is all unconsciously occurring. So you can think that you're the most rational decision maker in the world, and you can think that as a judge, for example, you can think that you're making decisions based on the calling balls and strikes, as we'd say here in the U.S., based on on the law and the evidence. And in fact, somehow on most major judgments, our Supreme Court, for example, The law and the evidence always seem to go 6-3 for the right wing.
Funny that. Yeah.
And you can predict with about 98% accuracy which way a judge is going to go, which means the judicial process is fundamentally flawed. That's another whole story. But for most things, what people actually do is that process that I described that sounds really irrational is actually not. Is that we make gut level judgments about all kinds of things. Like we make a gut level judgment of, does this person or does this party share my values? We make gut level judgments of there are really sort of four things in politics that are the most important gut level judgments. One is, do they share my values? The second is, do they understand and care about people like me? The third is, and fourth, the qualities of the particular leader. One is, does the person have strength? And the other is, does the person have warmth? And that combination of strength and warmth is what creates, interestingly, it not only creates, it's related to charisma or the lack of it. Parties on the left everywhere tend to ignore charisma as an important characteristic of their leaders. If you're gonna choose a leader, for God's sake, choose someone who people are going to listen to. Who are going to take seriously and who will feel engaged with. Because it's also characteristic, interestingly, of I have a colleague who's one of the world's leading primatologists, and he's studied chimps and bonobos and gorillas and humans last. But what he finds is that when you look at the characteristics of an alpha male, our idea is it's the gorilla that beats its chest the hardest. Well, beating your chest pretty hard is part of it. But it turns out that in all of those species, an alpha male is also defined by he's also the male who is who has the highest emotional intelligence. He's the one who can figure out how to get coalitions to work again, how to get people to shake hands and make up. Interestingly, gorillas shake hands, which I think is fascinating. It explains why Donald Trump sometimes shakes hands.
Okay, but so that's really interesting, because I think we think about political leadership, and perhaps we need to adjust a little bit our views about what strength looks like, and that's really encouraging, because I could see a more caring, coalition building type strength that certainly aligns to my values. But the bits that you said were the sort of number one and two things people actually think about when they make political decisions. Do they share my values, and are they talking about the things that I think are important? To me, both of those are proxies, or rather best served by like shorthand, almost gestures that say, I'm one of you. Doesn't have to be, here are my values, what do you think? They can just be, this is my vibe. And that's really problematic, because you can fake that pretty instantly. Like Nigel Farage, a wealthy stockbroker, is able to fake it by like pretending that he's a man of the people who understands people on low incomes. This is mad, but he does it through identity shorthand, right?
Welcome to what we're living through in the U.S. with a failed billionaire who never was a billionaire until he became president the second time, and now he's intending to be the richest man on earth, and probably will be in 3 years. But it's great when you can make trades of American sensitive technology to the United Emirates and in turn get a Trump hotel. Yeah. but it's too late then, isn't it? Right, because that's already happened. Is it just confirmation bias? Do people believe the first thing and then he says something else, and they believe the next thing because they bought into the first thing? Like, is it as simple as that? How did it start? How did he get there in the first place? How do these figures become these sort of identity beacons in the first place? It's another great question. That's another one where I'd say, like, but the first question that you asked was about, how much is emotion pulling things and how much is reason pulling things. I should have qualified that by saying that people differ on the extent to which they allow rational processes to kick in. or the extent to which they sort of, I grew up in the American South, so I heard mostly right-wing stuff. But what it did for me was it gave me a right ear that was tuned to the frequencies of the right, and to what their concerns were. Many of them were racist concerns, and others were concerns that the left made the mistake of interpreting as racist inaccurately.
Right.
And that's something that I think is happening all over Europe with immigration. In the U.S., for example, there was a change in our immigration laws in the late 60s to try to make them no longer racist, favoring white people from Western Europe, white people from Europe. And it was well-intentioned, and they didn't think that it was going to have all that much of an effect because there was still, if you had a relative who was from somewhere else, they could more easily immigrate to the U.S. But it turned out it didn't work that way, and we ended up not only having a massive shift in our demographics from white to non-white, which by 2040 will have shifted things from the 1980s, 88% white of European ancestry, to 2040, over 50% people of color. On the one hand, we progressives think, well, that's a great, it's a great thing that we stopped the racist stuff. We stopped saying, the whiter you are, the better your chances of coming to America. And that wasn't fair. But then what we also didn't take into account was that in the old days, if you wanted to emigrate to America, you would take a boat from Europe, and you'd land at Ellis Island in New York. You'd get processed, and 7 years later, you were a citizen. I mean, you would show up for a ceremony, and unless you'd killed somebody, and you were a citizen. Now we have no Ellis Island, and so what ends up happening is, with all that's happening in Latin America, with all the political instability, and once we have more climate instability, this is going to be an even bigger problem. Is we've had millions, an influx of millions of people from completely different ethnicities, races, etc. And what the left correctly perceives is that a lot of the reaction that people have to that is a tribalism and racism that is built into our DNA. We weren't built for multicultural societies. We have managed to be able to create some that work, but it really helps to have things like, my kids had early exposure to people I didn't. They went to a private school that was half white and half black in Atlanta, which is extremely unusual. So they grew up not even noticing color, and that's more true of younger people everywhere, in the West. Whereas my generation, the first thing we unconsciously code, the two things are gender and color. And we may or may not continue to apply many prejudices from the old days based on that. It may just be something we notice, but people differ on the extent to which they carry those old prejudices unconsciously as well as consciously. They also differ on the extent to which, and this is where I was heading, the extent to which they can hear things. So that what the left did, which was a huge mistake, was so when people say, I'm concerned about immigration, and there are some reasons to be concerned about immigration in the United States. It has not been well regulated. We haven't been letting in terrible people. I mean, we've had a flood of 20, 30 million more who reproduced at a rate that's 3 times what typical Americans reproduce at, so that the average baby born in the United States today is Latino.
Yeah.
And the problem with that is, if you say it's white versus non-white, you're missing the fact that a lot of people are responding to that a lot of people are responding to the fact that, all cultures are self-sustaining. We all want our culture. I mean, you in Europe have a tougher situation with all the Syrians who came in 2015. You obeyed international laws. You acted like decent people. You let people in who were fleeing danger, but you knew that there were Trojan horses among them, and it's not like you can just say, "Could you tell me, are you a terrorist?" You're not going to get a good response. So the public develops fears like that, and you make them worse on the left by pouring gasoline on it by calling them racist. We would have done so much better, like in the U.S., to take our example, to say, look, we've had a serious change in our demographics, and yes, it looks like white non-white, but it's not just that. It's that many of us really value the Western civilization that we inherited from Europe, and those are the principles that guide our lives. And so we're happy to have culture change in a direction that's more progressive, but we don't particularly want to bring in people who believe that women should be below men, that gay people should be thrown off of roofs. And those are legitimate, they're legitimate concerns. But our tendency on the left is when they say immigrant bad, we say immigrant good, as opposed to saying it depends on how immigration is done. And if they hear that you're on the left and you're willing to say, no, I don't think you're a racist. I don't start out from that.
Yeah, right.
If you do that, then they can hear you. And it makes all the difference in the world.
That's really interesting. So Nigel Farage, for instance, in the UK, started off being a wealthy stockbroker, somebody who's very unrelatable to, in truth, by the audience that now commands his following. But presumably, by your theory, started off saying things that were the things people actually cared about at the time. And all of everybody else was frightened to talk about immigration. So he had an uncontested floor to start talking about the things that people wanted to hear. They were bored of being told they were wrong, and then his sort of values, I suppose, evolved from there. People ended up thinking, well, he's talking my language, and he's saying the things that I agree with, and he's being very principled sounding about it, even though what he's really doing is actually manipulating an issue for nothing other than aggrandizement and promotion. Is that fair? But
no, and part of the problem is that we weren't constructed to live in bands of millions. We were constructed to be able to interact with our leaders the way you do with your councils. And so you have personal interactions with your council members. You may be on the same football team, or or you support the same football team, or you're on an amateur league or something, and across the aisles you're playing together, and so you get to know each other as a person, and you also when you see people's eyes face to face, it's a lot easier to read them, demagoguery is a lot easier to do at a distance than it is close up.
Let's talk about the role of social media in that then, because presumably this has just amplified that distance advantage, because nothing's up front and close and personal, and the tribe is millions or hundreds of millions of people. Is that the main problem, or are there bigger problems with social media in politics?
It plays into what's called, what I've described, which is called motivated reasoning. When you're motivated to reason to a particular conclusion, it plays into that in a really awful way, which is now, we have siloized information so that an algorithm feeds you information that already supports what you believe. And then you don't even hear the other information a lot of the time. I mean, you have to really seek it out. And it's interesting. One of the things that I do as a political consultant, particularly political message consultant, is when I watch an interview or watch the news, I listen to the commentators and to the talking heads, whether they're political leaders or they're commentators. I listen with a right ear and a left ear as if I were a straight down the middle independent.
Yeah.
And I do that because I don't want to let those biases kick in that are going to stop me from understanding what people on the other side in the other tribe are thinking. Because actually, I think in fact, we just did a study. There's a huge range of overlap in values across the U.S. I mean, we're talking 70%, 75% overlap in values. But the extremes get heard and they get amplified, and people define themselves by where they fall on those extremes, and then they start to get information that backs up the view on their side, and they're off to the races.
So you mentioned being able to inoculate against the negative reaction that people have to their sort of political opponents by saying, I'm not calling you a racist, or basically by actually, in a relational sense, seeing them in some way. How do you do that at a distance and at scale? Because I can see how that works in, Leave voting North Norfolk, which has historically had a very heavy sort of right of centre lilt, but which elected me and, a few weeks ago elected 7 out of 9 Liberal Democrat councillors. And that's because I think we have the privilege of that close relationship, being able to speak to people individually on the doorstep. And, many of the things that you've described, I realise are things that we do, including, trying to see where people are coming from. That doesn't work in an echo chamber online. So how do you change someone's mind at scale with a kind of values proposition that you've described works so well, presumably for all sides, right? This is just as much on the far left as it is the far right.
Okay, so I've now tested hundreds of thousands of messages on the range of issues in the U.S. with over 100,000 voters, and so I've been able to test, what kind of messages work and don't work, and I've seen that there is an invariant story structure to political communication. That if you don't have this structure, it's not your message isn't going to work as well, and it may not work at all. And that is, you start out with I often call it, if you're thinking about like this can apply to a 15-second interaction. It can apply to a speech you give. It can apply to a brief interview. It can apply to anything. But you always want to start out with connection with your audience. If you just present yourself as someone who is worth listening to, you say a value like on immigration. Every country has the right to decide who lives within its borders, based on, as we do, based on our interests and our values as a nation.
Yeah.
Who can argue with that? So you could start out with a huge advantage if you just avoid toxic language that tells people, that immediately says, I'm not one of you. The second part of a message that's essential is to raise people's concerns or anxieties or anger about a problem. And the third part is to restore hope that there is some way that we can get back to fixing this problem. And the way that progressives try to do that last piece is also problematic. We try to throw 10-point plans at them, and we'd say, this is my policy. It's like, no. Actually, what you really need to say is, from start to finish, I want to tell you what I believe. I believe that people should be treated fairly. So I think it's pretty reasonable to say that no one should face environmental dangers like chemical waste dumps next to their home just because of the color of their skin or how humble their home. And if you pair how humble their home with the color of their skin, you will also do much better, because now you're putting together in the U.S. white people and people of color.
Yeah.
And if you then go on to give them your 10-point plan, you're cooked. If instead you say, I understand this problem, and this is something that my government will take seriously and take care of. I can't promise you that we'll solve it 100%. I can promise you that we will focus on that. If you give people just a taste of it, then they get the sense that you're serious about this, and now you've completed the arc from I'm like you, I have a concern that I think you should share, and I'm hopeful that we can do something about it, but I'm not going to promise you things that aren't true. And to tell you the truth, I think voters everywhere would love to hear a political leader who talked like that, who said, I'm not going to promise you things I can't do.
Drew, that was absolutely fascinating and contains some shockingly straightforward things that explain how we've ended up where we are. And I feel optimistic as well. I don't think this is a sort of substitute way of manipulating people that involves being just as bad as the people we're trying to counter. I think it sort of feels very human and very liberal, actually, to be able to speak to people on their terms about the things that they care about. So faith restoring, deeply challenging, but very, very much evidence led. Thank you very much for your contribution and for joining us on Politics Unchained.